This is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. In central Washington state, it can be challenging, if not outright impossible for some families, to find reliable, affordable childcare. That was true even before the COVID-19 pandemic hit. Janelle Retka of the Yakima Herald-Republic is closely tracking these so-called childcare deserts and how they're impacting young children, families, and the region's economy. She joins us now. Janelle, welcome to EWA Radio.
Thanks, Emily. Thanks for having me.
Why did you want to do a project on childcare?
Well, I came to the Herald about 2 years ago, and within the first month of being the education reporter for the Herald, I heard about some legislature that was being discussed in our capital around childcare, and it kind of piqued my interest. I started looking into it and found that in Yakima County, where I'm based, the number of childcare programs and openings or slots for children had been declining for several years. So as of 2021, from 2015 to 2020, there had been 700 childcare slots that had declined just in this county alone. And at the same time, I was hearing from parents and providers that they were having a hard time navigating the system. So parents could hardly afford childcare or were being edged out of support systems from the state or federal level. And a lot of providers were kind of living on the poverty line. So I was realizing that there was kind of this issue on several different sides of the childcare system that no one really had a clear solution for. And it just piqued my interest. I wanted to know what this meant for families and also what it meant for the kids who maybe had unstable support or didn't have childcare access at all.
For people who may not be familiar with it, give us a sense of central Washington. What are some of the demographics?
So, in central Washington and in Yakima County specifically, we're on the ancestral land of the Yakima Nation. And so we have some Yakima natives here, as well as a large population of Latino or Latinx community members. In our largest school district here in Yakima, over 75% of the student population is Latino or Latinx. And, this is something that kind of came up with the pandemic. Roughly 63% of jobs in Yakima County specifically are in essential fields, and agriculture is a big one of those. So that draws a lot of migrant workers, primarily from Mexico, but also from other Spanish-speaking countries. And so that's a really big part of kind of the cultural dynamic of Yakima, and that branches out to other portions of central Washington, but is definitely true here in this county specifically. And we also have a really big poverty level. About 20% of Yakima County residents live in poverty.
So you've given us a sense of central Washington. What is the childcare landscape like for Washington state as a whole?
It definitely varies from one area to the next, but I think one really striking data point is that licensed childcare providers throughout Washington state can only support 17% of children who are 13 and under. So this isn't just an issue in Yakima County or in central Washington. Even in the Puget Sound area, it's something that parents are up against.
Well, we know certainly that childcare is a challenge for folks who may not have the money to spend on private services and programs. How available are then the nonprofit opportunities or programs that are offered through social services?
So there's a huge population of people here who qualify for and rely on state subsidies. And this is called the Working Connections Partnership in Washington state. It essentially provide a portion of the pay for childcare for parents who are either working or pursuing work. And that also applies to parents or guardians who are in school programs, so pursuing a career path. And so, what it does is it kind of gives a sliding rate for parents. And if a provider is qualified in the early learners or early achievers program, which means that the kids in that program are receiving some learning opportunities that are vetted by the state and they say are going to kind of better prepare those kids for kindergarten, then parents can access subsidies in these programs, whether that's a center or in-home provider. And what that does is it covers a portion based on their income, the parent's income, so that they just pay a portion of the childcare. And so that's really helpful to parents, but you have to be at 200% or less of the federal poverty line, which is complicated because in Washington, we're edging closer to that $15 minimum wage. So parents are actually getting edged out of those resources. and that makes it a little bit harder for them to access it. And in some cases, I've talked to parents who have had to turn down promotions because they can't afford the promotion. They can't afford to lose the support in childcare that they would if they took that leg up.
That's incredible. So parents are actually holding themselves back in the career field because the money that they would get from that wouldn't be enough to cover what they're getting from the state for childcare?
Right, exactly. And also in programs like Head Start and ECAP, which are the state and federal early learning programs, I've talked to administrators who are saying that it's becoming increasingly hard for them to find parents who qualify for the low income level that qualifies them to have their kids in the program, which to them means that there are more parents who are being edged out and put in this gap of not being able to afford to pay for care on their own, but also not qualifying for these support systems that are meant to really make sure that there's equitable access to rich and secure early learning opportunities.
What comes through, I think, in your reporting is that there are a lot of good intentions and there's a lot of money that's being poured into the system, but it sounds like it's not necessarily aligning with what parents actually need to help them.
Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah, I think that there's a lot of goodwill, and I think the pandemic has really put a spotlight on the importance of childcare. Even before the pandemic, there was bipartisan agreement that this was a problem. Some researchers for the state actually in 2019 declared the childcare market a broken market in Washington state. So there was some awareness that this was an issue. I think the pandemic has brought light to why childcare is so important, not just for parents and children, but also for our broader economy. And so there's a lot of people whose eyes are on this right now, which is encouraging to a lot of childcare providers and to a lot of bodies that have been working to kind of resolve some of these problems for years. But there's not really consensus yet on how to fix this multifaceted problem. So that's something that's still in development, and it'll be interesting to see what comes out of both the state and federal level this year, because there's a lot of optimism that with so much attention on childcare through the pandemic, there might be some progress in areas that have been long needed but are just now being brought to everyone's attention.
When we talk about things like the potential for learning loss for older students who have been out of school or have been doing remote learning and potentially not getting as much instruction or learning time as they would have if they were in the classroom, what does that mean for young children who would have potentially have been in childcare for the last year? What does the research show about the potential developmental benefits to them of being in those care settings?
Well, I'm going to take a step back, which is to go to 2015 when Washington State passed the Early Achievers Act. With that, their goal was to really transform childcare centers into early learning environments because they were seeing that roughly half of kindergartners were starting out what is called kindergarten ready. So, ready to listen to teachers, share, hold a pencil, understanding numbers and letters. And they thought, okay, childcare is a really good opportunity to integrate some of those things through maybe play based care to make sure that there's more equal opportunity for students across the state to enter into the K 12 system and be successful then. And so that's kind of a recognition of the work in early learning that a lot of providers have already been doing, but it's prompted kind of a push to standardize that and to make the learning opportunities in childcare more consistent. What we know from research on the early brain is that in the first 5 years, roughly 90% of the brain has developed. So these early years are really important for behavioral health and development, learning opportunities, and mental health and physical health later in life. And so one of the key indicators of whether there will be opportunities that uplift kids or barriers during these early years is stability. And so a caring and stable environment is really crucial. That's both in the home life as well as in the environments that these kids are in outside of the home. And so I think one of the biggest factors that I've heard is just having stable childcare if kids are going to be in childcare is really important. So I think the instability of having kids maybe in and out of childcare during this pandemic could create some trauma for these kids and could interrupt some of their brain development and continuity in learning. So I don't think that anyone has a clear answer on what the impacts will be, but the concern is that this instability isn't going to be good.
Are there also concerns about students not getting identified for programs or services that might benefit them? I remember when I covered education in Nevada, the 0 to 3 program was a state program where childcare providers were supposed to be helping to identify kids who, for example, might need a hearing test or a vision test or potentially be referred to, outside providers for help with special education.
That's a really good question. I think that in childcare and early learning, there's still, at least in Washington state, there's still not a lot of progress to have systemic support for kids who might have special needs. Talking to one provider recently, she actually expressed that a lot of providers don't realize the kind of support that they could get in running programs if they do create supports for kids and families with special needs. And so I think that we're kind of in a position where there's a little bit more foundational need before providers can even get to providing support to families that need more needs. And so that's really edging out families that have special needs and edging them out of these learning opportunities in a lot of cases. I think it's a huge struggle for families with kids with special needs to find secure care and to have that be stable and rich for those kids.
We're talking with Janelle Retka of the Yakima Herald-Republic about how a declining child care sector is edging out young learners in central Washington state. We wanted to mention that Janelle's project is supported in part by an EWA Reporting Fellowship. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And thank you to everyone who has rated us on iTunes. Your support and feedback are helping us to grow. Janelle, I want to talk to you a little bit about the providers. What did you hear from them in terms of some commonality or challenges that they were facing, especially during the pandemic? Was it really all about the money?
Um, no, but the money is really important. Even before the pandemic, childcare providers and especially in home providers were really struggling because as the state has moved more towards creating childcare centers as early learning environments, that's meant that providers are having to pursue increasing continued learning opportunities in early learning understanding, which is great. But these people are already short on time and money. So having the time to go to these community college courses, for example, might be something that a 24-hour childcare provider just doesn't have, let alone the funds if they can't access scholarships to go to those programs. And so that was kind of one of the issues that program providers were up against even before the pandemic hit. Then, when the pandemic hit, they had a declining number of children in attendance, which literally translates to a drop in the provider's income because providers are paid by the hours that kids are in their classroom. And early in the pandemic, the state did support the subsidy payments of children based on enrollment prior to the pandemic rather than actual attendance to help buffer that. But that actually elapsed pretty early in the pandemic. So there's a drop in income for providers. There's also an increase in the cost of running childcare programs during the pandemic. They have to do increased sanitation. They have to have a smaller number of people in their classrooms to abide by safety and social distancing rules. There's an increased need for, toilet paper and things like that. And so they're seeing costs go up. They're having to continue paying their utilities, and they have a far smaller income to support those costs, which is important to note, especially because a lot of these providers were, as I said, already on the margins of poverty.
Did you encounter any parents who have found creative solutions to this childcare desert?
A few. They're not necessarily like these groundbreaking secrets or keys. I've heard from families who have grouped up in pairs to maybe hire a private nanny that they split instead of sending their kids to a childcare program, which I think is probably the most creative and positive solution that I've heard of. But a lot are turning to informal care, which can be really great if that's with a grandparent or auntie. But it also means that there might not be as much support for those early learning incorporations, depending on the access that that family has to outside resources. And I've also heard of a lot of families becoming single income households, which in a community that already teeters on poverty is not necessarily a good thing.
Well, we know certainly nationally that it's women primarily that have left the workforce to come home and take care of the kids.
Yeah, and that's definitely the case here as well. And one other thing that I should mention, I've also heard from parents who are bringing their kids to work with them. And so there has been some, positive flexibility of employers to say that's okay, but I think that's pretty few and far between. But yeah, we're definitely seeing people and probably disproportionately women having to leave work. And it's definitely a struggle for families in a way that it already was, but it's increasing.
In addition to your reporting, you're also communicating with your readers through a newsletter. Why is that the way you wanted to help tell the story?
I think when I started really digging into this story, I realized that, I don't want this to just be kind of old school reporting that goes out and says, here are the facts. I really wanted this to be something that could help people figure out how to better navigate this system because on all sides, whether that's the parent, the provider, or even businesses that rely on stable childcare, there's a need for solutions. And so I wanted this to be both a solutions focused series as well as something that incorporated the community as part of the reporting process. I really wanted it to be a two-way street where it's not just me providing information, but community members are involved in the process. And so I felt like a newsletter was a really good way to make the channel of communication more open, as well as to make it clear that this is a journey. This isn't just one project that gets dumped on a certain day. It's an ongoing effort to look into what this sector looks like, where there are gaps, and where there are potential solutions that are either existing or yet to be developed.
I was talking with a reporter once and I asked him if he had a favorite question that he liked to ask when we were talking about higher ed admissions. And he said he likes to ask admission officers what keeps them up at night. And I thought that was a great question. And I'm wondering, do you have a question you regularly ask on this story about for the parents or providers that's produced some interesting answers?
Well, that's a great question that he asked. I love that. For me, I would say that the question is really simple. It's what is your experience? Because I found that among both providers and parents, how they view childcare and how they have experienced this struggle is really different from one person to the next. And so just asking that question and giving people the opportunity to share their experience has really cracked this story open and allowed me to understand just the nuance of it really, and it's I think made the reporting a lot richer and also helped providers and parents see that they are part of this story and that their experience does matter. And so I think that that's also increased the buy-in from the community and I think is continuing to make this series really rich.
I feel like childcare and early learning has moved from the back burner to the front burner for a lot of education reporters and for their newsrooms, probably, and I think fairly, because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'd love to ask you some questions to help them better cover the story in their own communities. What are a few resources that you found that have been particularly valuable?
I would say that the most valuable resource for me has been Childcare Aware of Washington, which is a branch of the National Childcare Aware organization. They do a lot of tracking on childcare. And in Washington state, they were actually dubbed the organization that would help orchestrate childcare through the pandemic. So, whether that's connecting parents with open slots or providers with resources to help them stay afloat during the pandemic. They also have been tracking childcare deserts and supply for years. So I would imagine that this is the case in other states as well, but they'll be able to tell you where there were so-called deserts or, a vast undersupply of childcare compared to childcare aged children, as well as how that's either improved or worsened. In Washington state, they're tracking this on a weekly basis. So they can tell me, the number of providers that are closed in a given week. And keep in mind that those aren't all permanent, but data shows that a lot of them will be permanent if these providers don't get support and intervention to help them stay open. They're also tracking vacancies. So there's kind of this interesting thing happening right now during the pandemic, which is that because there are so many parents keeping their kids home with them while there are stay at home orders or lockdowns, there's actually this unique opportunity for new parents to enter into the childcare market where there might not have been openings before. And so that's maybe positive for parents who didn't have access to childcare previously but are searching for childcare now. it's also what kind of makes the providers' incomes decline. So they're seeing these huge numbers of availabilities that they didn't previously have, which again means that their paychecks are smaller. And so Childcare Aware tracks that. They track how many programs are closed and they track how many vacancies there are in a given county so that you can really get a feel for where there's a more dire situation in one area than the next.
If I'm a reporter and I'm looking at a child care center or program, what are some of the hallmarks of a high quality one?
Well, research shows that one of the most important things is that providers have a rich relationship and communication with both the child and the parent. And so you really want to see close relationships between providers and programs and the parents, where they kind of understand the family dynamic outside of the childcare center and can provide support or referrals for families to get extra resources in the community, and also that same kind of communication with the kids. Whether this is an infant or a 5-year-old, you want to see really rich conversation where, there's in a lot of cases play-based learning, but explanations of what things mean for these kids. I would say that that's one of the biggest successes that you might be able to see is these opportunities to have kids understand their learning opportunity and really engage in that in a fun way that's relevant to them.
And on the flip side of that, what are the red flags that reporters maybe should be looking out for?
I would say in Washington state, the state does a really thorough job of tracking and licensing programs. And so they go in and they regularly meet with providers and let them know areas where there's room for improvement. Some of these might be really minor things like, oh, we want you to, reorganize so that there's a little bit more free space for a kid to play. And others might be a little bit more of a slap on the wrist. And so with those violations, as they call them, that are a little bit more concerning, they keep a tally on the State Department of Children, Youth, and Family website so that families can actually go and look and see, is this provider a provider that I feel safe having my kids with? And so that puts a lot of the leadership in the family's hands where they're able to see how these providers are measured or graded.
Are there a few story ideas for local reporters who may be covering childcare and very young learners in their own communities?
Yeah, I would say I think the thing that has sparked the most interest for me, and this is a story that we're still working on for the series, is to really map out where there was supply or what supply looked like in childcare before the pandemic versus mid-pandemic. And that's data that I've received from Childcare Aware, but we're just trying to map it out so people can really get a visual of kind of where these gaps in childcare access might be. And we're also planning on overlapping supply with family income or poverty levels because we think that that might open up some ideas of where there might be a lack of resources for families, both in the home and in the community at large. So I would say that that might be a good starting place to get a feel for what that looks like in the community that you're covering. And then I would also say just talk to providers and parents. Here in Washington, we have a union that providers are a part of, and there's different categories of that. So for in home providers, for example, they have a leader of that union that represents them specifically. And talking to these providers will both give you insight into what their biggest concerns are, or like you said earlier, what keeps them up at night, as well as some connections to talk to other providers in the area and hear more experiences and get those anecdotes that really bring this issue to life. Similarly, they can connect reporters with families, but schools are also a good resource for connecting with families who are in childcare because a lot of times they're aware of when families don't have access to early learning environments prior to entering kindergarten, for example.
It sounds like you're learning a lot from this project, but you're also, I think, having fun doing it.
Yeah, I am learning a lot. There is so much to crack open in this, and I feel like I'm just getting started. It's kind of like when you research something and you realize you become more aware of what you don't know. So I'm trying to get through those areas and really become more familiar with the different angles of this issue. But I am having a lot of fun. It's really fun to be able to tell people's story and really feel like the work that you're doing is helping. I've already heard back from a lot of parents and providers that this research on brain development or just noting the gaps in access has been really helpful to them. And in our most recent edition, we actually released a little form with tax tricks on how parents can reduce their what they owe in their taxes or boost their return by filling out these kind of existing but widely unknown tax breaks in their federal taxes. And so I think having things like that is really benefiting people. That's what we're here for as reporters. And that brings me a lot of joy to know that my reporting is helping people. I think also one thing that's been fun about this project is we're making sure that it's available in both English and Spanish because we want to make sure that this doesn't just reach our kind of main readership, but can really reach into parts of the community that we've failed or not done a great job of reaching before, so that it's really making an impact and not just becoming another journalism series, but is actually interacting and engaging the community.
Well, I want to encourage people to go take a look at the project, and for another reason to see it visually, and that, Janelle, is for your really charming illustrations, which were done by you. And I think that's a first for me to see a project, at least in recent memory, where the reporter is also the illustrator.
Yeah, it's been really fun. Thanks for noting that. I really enjoy illustration and actually like going back to my childhood, thought that I was going to be a children's author and illustrator. And so that's been something that I've always enjoyed, but as I've gotten further into my career has not been the focus of my work. And with this project, it just seemed like such a perfect fit to make the landing page and the illustrations more playful because this is a kids-based project. And we also want to reach people that might not be as engaged in traditional media. And so incorporating infographics that are hand-drawn and things like that, we hope will kind of catch more people's eye and draw in readers that we might not have traditionally accessed. But I've also been having a lot of fun drawing. I really enjoy that I'm able to incorporate my different passions into this project.
Janelle, why don't you tell people where they can find your beautiful illustrations and, of course, the full project?
Yeah, anyone can find that at yakimaherald.com/special_projects/growth_gap.
Janelle Retka is the education reporter for the Yakima Herald-Republic, and the EWA Reporting Fellowship project is The Growth Gap, How a Declining Childcare Sector is Edging Out Young Learners. Janelle Retka, thank you for making time for EWA Radio.
Thanks so much for having me. This has been a pleasure.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there is a story or a reporter you want to learn more about, drop us a line with radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, take care of yourselves, and thank you for listening.